Hello, Sex Therapy 101 friends. You notice I might have taken a break, but we're back and we're excited. And I'm really passionate about this new series that I'm going to be offering to all of you. I haven't disappeared. I've been working on some projects that are really meaningful to me. And one of those is a book for the public about my research about regarding long-term outcomes of consenting to unwanted sex or duty sex, as we sometimes call it. And in doing that, adding to my own research over the year, you'll see my hair change, my face change, because these were all recorded over the course of a year. And I wanted to talk to experts about the cultural implications or cultural beliefs or the cultural ideas among different communities in the US that might protect people against negative outcomes and that might actually kind of promote people into some of the more negative outcomes. And that is the series I have to offer you. I'm really excited. It's been really meaningful to me. It's been enlightening to me. It's really helped me make sure that this book is what I want it to be for all of you. So with no ado, here we go. This is going to be the intro for the whole series. And I'll give you a little bit of a bio for each, and then we'll jump into the recording of the interview. This conversation was really fun with me, with Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers. She was maybe one of the first books I read in regards to the impact of purity culture with her book, Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, and her more recent book, which is called, it's for parents, called Shameless Parenting, Everything You Need to Raise Shame-Free, Confident Kids and Heal Your Shame Too. Tina is really fun to talk to. She's over in Washington, has a private practice where she trains therapists. She founded the Northwest Institute on Intimacy, and we're interested in a lot of the similar things and work with adjacent communities. And I really hope you love what she has to say as much as I do.
Hi, Cami.
Hi, Tina. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
I'm like a little fangirling right now. Honestly, I'm like, we're gonna talk to Tina.
Heavens, no, 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 no. That
But
hopefully won't last too long.
hopefully.
Yeah.
Anyway, a long time lover of your work, and I use it with a lot of my clients. So
Oh, I'm so glad. It always makes me happy to know it's out there being helpful to people.
yeah, it really is. I'm over here in Idaho, so similar, a little bit population, sometimes different
Yeah.
flavor, but working
Yeah.
with purity culture and shame, and
Yeah.
so. Mhm.
It just doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
You've been doing all you can. A lot of us have, but it's been
Yeah,
around.
exactly. A lot of us have. I was presenting on a so the do you know who STAR is? The
Mhm.
Society for Sexual
The
Training and
research.
Research.
Yeah.
STAR. Yeah. So I was
Yeah.
out in New York weekend before last, the discussant on a case that was basically religious sexual shame and trauma. It's somebody presenting with pelvic pain disorders, PCOS, and all kinds of things. And the person who presented the case, they used psilocybin in
Yeah.
the treatment protocol.
Yeah.
Um, and so then basically I was asked to be basically to because I
Yeah.
did in both places
Yeah.
to like look at that and say, do I agree with the way he did it, or would I do something different or whatever? So I was actually talking about your work when I was discussing it, because I said I really felt like this was important that we get
Hmm.
clear about the consensual non-consent stuff that so often is happening in our heterosexual couples, whether they come from religious backgrounds or not. We know that it's super prevalent, and it's
Yeah.
really not been looked at, sort of well enough yet. And
Mhm.
I know one person who just recently got her PhD, and she was looking at what creates sexual agency in midlife women. And
Amazing.
if you are high in sexual agency, does that mean you have, or excuse me, if you're high in just general agency and empowerment, does that mean
Yeah.
you're also high in sexual agency and
Yeah.
empowerment? And the answer was no. And
Mm.
if you improve people's sexual agency, does that improve their overall agency? And basically the answer is yes. And so sexual agency, which is really kind of, I think, also what you're getting at there,
Yeah.
is really important, and it's been so overlooked. And we have
Mm-hmm.
huge populations of women in particular that just don't even have any sense of understanding about that at all. Like
Agreed.
it's
Yeah.
over here and they're acting it out, but they're not connected to it or aware of it. So I think it's
Agreed.
really important work.
So tell me, you watched that video about my research, which is kind of,
Mhm. That's
maybe
great.
new, maybe not. But what would you describe with your clinical lens in relationships and sexuality? What do you see is the problem there, or what is happening there? How would you say with your lens what that is, these outcomes of consenting to unwanted sex?
Well, I think it's embedded in a huge historical epigenetic story
Mm,
that it's, that's very much informed by patriarchy. It can go all the way, depending on how you think about it, it can go all the way back to the formation of the Christian church,
mm,
that then has influenced America through and through. Um, that basically says sexuality is something that men have,
mm-hmm.
and it's for men, and it's how you keep men happy and you keep them from acting out.
Right.
It's how you are a good wife, and this is very much, it affects, I think, all people who identify as being women and were born women at birth and really are sort of, just see themselves as sort of cis female, even if they are queer. They've been raised in the culture as a cis woman, so they're
Mm-hmm.
going to absorb this. But I think it especially punctuates for women that are cis het and straight. They're
Okay.
cis het, they're
Mm-hmm.
straight, and so they're more apt to take the messages hook, line, and sinker and not think about them,
Mm-hmm.
not examine them. A queer woman is more likely to examine heterosexual or,
Mm-hmm.
normative ideas that are put out there and say, well, that doesn't really apply to me, or I don't like that, or that doesn't make sense. There's
Yeah.
more of a invitation to be critical of culture, right? But
Yeah.
inside the cishet world, especially for women, there's not very much, I think, general critiquing of what you're taught, depending on, and I think authoritarian homes have a lot to do with that as well. If you're raised in an authoritarian home that is all about obeying, and you can't know, other people know, you need to follow them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you are a good girl, a good boy. That's how you are a worthy person. You're going to be much less likely to be a critical thinker, because you
Mm-hmm.
were taught you're not to be trusted. Other people are to be trusted.
Right.
You can't know. They know what's best
Mm-hmm.
for you.
Really low
Other
internal control, all
No,
external.
all
Yeah.
external. And that's what's valued, is an external control, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it even reduces any natural inclination to question, unless they've been given a beautiful, subversive, rebellious little spirit that does ask questions, as some kiddos do. But a lot of people are like, that's just too frightening. I could stand to lose too much, right? Lose
Mm-hmm.
safety, lose protection, lose care, lose whatever. And so they don't. And we've seen that grow in the United States over the last 45 years, as we had a real dramatic turn when the religious right and moral majority kind of took over the Republican voting bloc. And it didn't matter if you were in a religious home or not. Religious education was now paid for by the public, by the government, right? We had
Mm-hmm.
abstinence-only education. It was religious. It was 80% medically inaccurate. It went out to the country. At
Yeah.
the same time that we withheld funding for sexual research. So we began to grow two things. One was a vacuum of actual knowledge of
Mm,
emotional health, relational health, sexual
mhm.
health, body awareness, right?
Yeah.
Even the awareness of what exploitation is. That was all taken away, right? While at the same time, this whole guise of family values was a front. What was happening behind closed doors with Congress and the government was a withdrawal or a removal of regulations on banks and a removal of regulations on the FCC, the Federal Communication, or the FCC, the
Hmm.
Federal Communication Commission. So anything that we produce that could go out on media, we took
Mm.
away the protections for the public that had been there prior to 1985. We removed them in 1984, I believe. And then basically, if you were a media company, which at that point was movies and TV primarily, and
Okay.
then it grew into music videos, video games, the internet, social media. So it grew
Hmm.
into those things.
Hmm.
All of those companies could do whatever was going to make their stockholders money that year. There were no regulations. You could say whatever you wanted. It could be misinformation. It could be out and out lies. It could be made up. It could be whatever was going to capture your audience and make your stockholders money, because that was the new value in American public life. It was making money
Yeah.
for corporations and wealthy people, wealthy men primarily. And we
Hmm.
began to reduce their taxes on corporations and taxes on the wealthy. This began in 1980 with Reagan, and it has continued every year since. We've never rolled back any of those laws at all, even though since as early as 1982 and every year almost since, there have been requests by, and you name it, Congress, most organizations, whatever, that are affected by violence against women. They have requested that we pass laws to protect against violence against women, and we have yet to pass any laws to protect women. And so we have been growing what we see now across the United States. We grew the homeschooling movement. We grew the Homeschooling Legal Defense Fund, which was a nonprofit that then would protect anybody who had a lawsuit, any family that had a lawsuit brought against them about what was happening at home to their children
Mm.
in the homeschooling arena. So if anybody reported anything, the
Yeah.
Legal Defense Fund stepped in and fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. So to
Wow.
this day, there are no rules on what you do with
Right.
your children when you homeschool them. Okay. So
Mm.
authoritarianism grew in the United States beginning in 1980 and 85, or, and has been growing in many ways since then, even though we also have very progressive new ideas and research coming out. And so those people who are learned, who did not grow up in those homes, who have some ability and permission to ask questions, are learning a whole lot of things. So we have this huge divide in our
Mm.
country between people who are aware of shifts and changes in cultural, you know, things going on, and just recognizing that we've had levels of diversity forever, and we've
Mm.
had all kinds of things forever, and we're now talking about it. And then
This
we've got
hasn't creeped up on us in the last couple years, right? Yeah.
right. No, it's been growing, but it just means we have some, I think, much more extreme kinds of stuff going on. So we have so many people that know less, feel less confident to express themselves or stand up for themselves or stand up for their kids. They are grabbing on to any misinformation that gets their amygdala going, right? Gets their fear centers going. They're just scared. They're scared to death.
Mm.
Um, but then meanwhile, their kiddo is going to a public school and comes home and they're 10 and they say, gosh, you know what? I think I figured out that I'm non-binary and pansexual. And their parents are losing it because they have no idea what that means, but it sounds like the devil.
Scary. Yeah.
It's very
Yeah.
scary to them, right?
Mhm.
So it's to me, it's been a growth of two different areas of a dearth of information, while at the same time, this authoritarian, I'm scared to death, I have to hang on to what other people say, without the realization that other people are saying that so they make more money for their stockholders, not because it's true.
Mhm.
They're
Mhm.
being used, they're being exploited,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
They are a pawn in their money-making scheme, you know?
Mhm.
And we could be talking about, whatever, Jeff Bezos now owning the, Washington Post, or Elon Musk with X, or, Murdoch with the New York Times, whatever. I mean, these people, it's been about them making money, and not money so they can have influence in the United States, money so they can have influence globally. They don't
Mhm.
care about the United States. They're dealing on the global scale.
Mhm. Mhm.
We're going to find ourselves in a heap of trouble
Mhm.
in no time, because the people that are running the country have a global perspective. They don't care about, even though they say certain things,
Yeah.
they don't ultimately care,
I I love this perspective of, I'm like, what lens are you looking at through this super systems lens, right?
Yeah.
Of going
Yeah.
all the way back to authoritarianism as it rose and the education as it fell at the same
Yes.
time.
Right.
And I had talked to one person about my work, and they were like, I just can't believe in 2024 that women are consenting to sex they don't want. That has like, and you're saying, I can see why it's happening. It was this,
Oh,
back in the
absolutely.
80s, the rise
Yeah.
of that and the fall of that. And here we are in
Yeah.
2024. Yeah. With women
Oh,
who've got.
absolutely. And
Mhm.
I think it's important for us as practitioners or educators or wherever we are to understand the historical context, partially so we can have some compassion for these people, you know, um, but also so we can see that if we don't look at it from a historical lens, we're going to be a player in it too,
Right.
you know. Um, so I think we have a responsibility to see it. Like most people don't know that the Southern Baptist Church, which is the largest force of the evangelical movement in the US and
Mhm.
has been forever, was pro Roe v. Wade from 74 to 79.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
This is absolutely documented. I could send you stuff. It's absolutely
Yeah.
documented. And the church was actually the sort of church in the US, the Southern Baptist Church and those affiliated, was actually pretty anti-political up until 1980. They
That
were very
when the
much like, politics makes us dirty. We want people to follow Jesus.
yeah.
And so the focus
Was
at
it
that point,
then was it John Bircher? Was what did the
well, the
start
John
date?
Bircher Society had gotten started in the late 50s, and it had been
Okay.
growing, but it was around communism
Yeah.
and this kind
Yeah.
of a thing. It
Yeah.
really wasn't related to the churches. Is what it was the churches had been segregationists. In other words, they
Mhm.
supported the religious colleges continuing to be segregated. Right. And when that became absolutely illegal, there was no federal funding that was going to come anymore. This was 1979. Carter, who was the president at the time, was really and still is the only evangelical president we've ever had. And he actually was very much for how do we take care of the poor and how do we do these things. But he could not be manipulated by those that wanted a capitalist agenda only. And so they found Reagan, who was willing to be the puppet to use for the very first time God language in his speeches. He said, God bless America. It had never been done before because there had been a separation of church and state prior to that. And then
I bet most people would not know that.
I know, right. And
Most
then
people would not
again,
know
it's all documented. Like I've got
that.
books, I've got,
Hmm.
research, the whole thing.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then he began supporting this capitalist agenda behind the guise of family values because they went after that voting block. They needed that voting block in order to pursue this agenda. And so there literally was a meeting in 1979 where they were like, we have to come up with a different issue than segregation to rally the voters. And it was at that meeting, this is well documented, that they chose abortion as the issue. And then they got some politicians on top of Jerry Falwell and Dobson and some others to just start putting it out there into the ether. And so for the first time, they began to get the churches, which Jerry Falwell was a huge piece of this, the churches to get behind the political thing that was going on. And this was all about protecting America, protecting families, protecting. And what happened that worked to their advantage was there was an economic downturn in 1980. Second wave feminism. So the women getting birth control pill in the 60s and then beginning to say, I don't want children now. I want to pursue a career. I want to have some of my own choices, right? All of these things that happened with reproductive rights. And then there were civil rights going on, of course, with Martin Luther King and all of that, which is all very important, and psychedelics. And it just started to freak, kind of like, we can use this. We could scare the public with this. And then AIDS hit the East Coast in 80 and the West Coast in 85. So they used this very vulnerable public to say the whole United States is going to hell in a handbasket. This is all because of, all of these things. We're losing our center. And they just, did this whole thing about family values. People not understanding that this had everything to do with a capitalist agenda, and I don't know if you know who Frank Schaeffer is, but his father, Francis Schaeffer, was in the middle of this. Frank is now 72. When he was in his 20s, he was a filmmaker. He helped his father put together the film series on what happened to the human race. Did you ever hear about that film series? It was all about abortion, how abortion was going to basically end the human race. It was incredibly frightening. You could probably look up on YouTube Samantha Bee and then Frank Schaeffer, and you'll get 2 episodes of hers where she interviewed him and tells the story of what happened in that meeting and all of it, But Frank wrote a book called Sex, Mom, and God, where he chronicles the meetings he was in and what politicians and religious leaders were a part of, what meetings that passed what policies to lead us in this direction. And I remember reading that book after I had seen the impact of purity culture, right? But I didn't understand how it happened or how we got there. And I found his book and it explained it all to me. And I couldn't believe how brutally honest he was. I kept expecting the pages to burst into flames because they were so he named places and people, really powerful people, still. And but it filled in the blank for me. It's oh, well, we couldn't as the public know all this was going on, but he was there in it. And then he goes from 1978 to 2008.
Those are the forces that allowed the purity movement of the 80s and 90s to be so dramatic, so influential, so so accepted by the churches.
Exactly. And so all of this is the last 45 years, right? But this got built upon what had been, a patriarchy that had been, women have these roles and men have these roles, and, it still erased women's sexuality and all that kind of thing. But then we had the 60s and 70s, which was the beginning of women having voice, the beginning of women having choice, the beginning of women saying, wait a minute, my sexuality matters. You have to think about Kinsey's research on women, and what he produced is what shut down his research. The public could handle, the Rockefeller Foundation, which supported his research, could handle what they found out about men. They could not handle what they found out about women, right? But this was all happening at that same early time too. So women were picking this up because this was published, started picking up, and they started having these women's circles where they would talk together about their sexuality. And it was part of the National Organization of Women that got started, and the Equal Rights Amendment that got started, in the late 60s and early 70s. And this was a lot of things going, but then it all got shut down. And we have only gone backwards. We have not gone forward since 1979. And I think this affects me so much, or I get so kind of caught up in this too, because I grew up in a Swedish immigrant home that was
Mm,
very body and sex positive. That's all I thought families were, that you talked
yeah.
about bodies, like you talked about recipes and brushing your teeth, and like everyone, like my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles, my parents, like they talked about this stuff as just normal, and I didn't realize until I was well into my 30s, like my family was weird. It was not
Mm,
that every family was like mine. Like I was in a very small minority of families that got to grow up believing that bodies are bodies and bodies are good and sexuality is what you have. And it's part of how we
mhm,
love and bond with people. And we take responsibility. And I mean, just stuff,
mhm.
and then I was
You
like,
didn't realize it was like Northern European values
no, I
that
didn't.
you had kind of protected you from the Puritan.
No, I didn't know. I didn't know at
Yeah.
all. And because I was born in 1960, by 1980, I was 20.
Yeah.
So as I was involved in the Jesus movement, but it was kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and people saying, I'm coming off drugs and I feel so loved. And it was very different than anything you see now. And I thought it was delightful. And then as the church began to turn really legalistic in 1980 and kept going, I just stayed. I was like, I don't think Jesus is a part of that. I
Hmm.
think that's about something else. And but I also didn't develop a because of my age, I didn't really see what was happening to families and to culture until about the year 2000. And I was
Mm.
teaching sexuality in a graduate marriage and family therapy program. And I had my students write their sexual autobiography because I'm like, you're only as good a therapist as you know what your stories are. And this isn't one that a lot of people know. I want you to see it. I want you to write it as a narrative. And then I
Yeah.
want you, if you will, to allow me to read it
Mm.
as a loving, empathic other and give you feedback, maybe the feedback you never got, like you are beautiful and normal and healthy. And I wish somebody was there to hug you and tell you this when you were 5 and 8 and 10 and 12 and whatever they say, right? So
Your
I,
class was like the biggest group therapy session.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'd have people say, I was scared to write this. I heard about it my whole grad school,
Oh.
having you read and write on my paper was the most nourishing thing
Mm.
I've ever had happen. And that was the most important paper I wrote in all the 300 papers that I wrote in grad school, whatever. And I'm like, it's because you're great. You're lovely and wonderful. And I'm so sorry you didn't receive those messages as you were growing up, right? But I didn't know what I was seeing initially in 2000 when I would have, 25-year-olds describing pelvic pain or erectile dysfunction or scared to death to go date someone because they were afraid they were going to hurt them because they'd been told they were an animal, or scared to go out because they'd heard that, men were animals, and they were
Yeah.
just scared that they would do something wrong and they would be marked. And I'd like, what happened? Like, tell me what happened to you. And I spent about 3 years trying to figure out, like, what's changed. And that's when I started learning about what had been happening in people's homes, in their
Mm.
communities, in abstinence education, and in youth groups.
Yeah.
And I was mortified. Like I literally would cry through reading these. And so
Hmm.
then I was like, I need to start keeping research notes on what I'm reading. And then I got to start talking about this because I don't know that anybody knows that we've been actually, if you think about sexual abuse as some adult comes in at an age of a child's development and then puts their adult sexuality upon it and
Yeah.
takes away their child development, takes away their innocence, basically.
Right.
This had been happening to children
Mm.
from the moment they found their genitals at 11 months old. And every single time after that point, someone was there, slap their hand, yell at them, tell them they're gross, tell them God can't love them, tell them all kinds of things that weren't true when they were just being beautifully human little people growing up.
I'd never thought
So,
about like you're describing it as sexual abuse without sexual contact.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Yeah.
the formation of my curiosity and my ability to act out my curiosity, and somebody to go, yeah, That's your penis. It's a fabulous part of you. Let's finish diapering you. Or,
Mhm.
of course, you were curious about what your friend's body looked like. That's part of being 5 years old, but we're going to keep our clothes on and keep playing. Like
Mhm.
nobody, not only were they not giving them the education that they need in a non-shaming, just educational way, they were shaming them. They were basically frightening them, which
Mhm.
said to them something about me, who I am, is fundamentally bad. And
Mhm.
it's happening from pre-verbal over and over and over and over again. So, because from 11 months to what, 3 or 4, kids don't have the cognitive capacity to be like, oh, yeah, I keep being told I can go use the bedroom or my bathroom, and that's where I should go if I want to touch myself, if somebody
Yeah.
said that, in a loving way. But they're not going to remember, start to get that until they're 3 or 4. So do you think they stopped touching themselves? No, of course they
Mhm.
didn't, right? And so we're talking about pre-verbal, and every time they're quote unquote caught in everything that scares their parents around their sexual development or body development or whatever, while they're not getting things like body autonomy and what's cassette and consent and what's a misuse of my power, how I treat my brothers and sisters or people who are younger, like none of these basic relational things are being taught to them. But what is being taught to them is the misinformation that's coming from the media that is now filling more and more of the outlets in our life. But that's all about making money, but we don't sell it that way. But that's what it's about. And so we're telling kids and showing kids all kinds of things that not only are quote unquote entertainment, but since we're not giving them real knowledge, then they don't know how to apply. If they start applying the entertainment to their relationships are going to have problems, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So we have, all kinds of messages about what men need, and women are responsible. Men act out, women are responsible. That goes back to the formation of 4th century, goes all the way back, right? When the early bishops who were denying the body couldn't do that, they blamed the women. Right. So we've been doing this. We've been blaming the victim forever. And
Mhm.
so this has continued, and we don't have enough places where we examine, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, we don't even ask fathers of daughters, how do you want your daughter to be treated by other men? How did you
Right. And
treat other men or
you
other?
did like this, you said something that kind of did a flip which I appreciate because I don't want to be in this silo and been thinking about, women autonomy and assertiveness and sexual communication skills. And then you said, but are we talking about the misuse of power? Are we talking to the men? Are we talking? And I was like, oh, yeah,
Right.
that's the other side of the coin, is
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
who's
Like,
examining
mhm,
the use of power. Yeah.
exactly. Like, and I think because I was immersed in this, it was a very present idea as I was raising my kids. So
Mm.
I taught in a program, and we had like a value statement we called it the Orca stance: openness, respect, curiosity, and accountability to my power. That I
Mhm.
have the power to hurt people. And I have
Mhm.
some places where I own more power, and I have to be accountable to that power. Right.
Mhm.
So this was a part of how we talked all the time.
Mhm.
And I can remember my kids are 5 years apart, and I can remember my son maybe being 9 and my daughter like 4. And I could hear my son, because they shared a room, I could hear my son say, how about I give you a lollipop and you clean the room?
Mm.
And I
Little exploitation there, a little
sure,
bit.
sure, right. But
Little-
we are hardwired to get what we want. That's human. So
Yeah.
it's not bad. It's just my job to help him learn, right? And so
Mhm.
I said, hey, buddy, I said, would that feel fair to you if she was 9 and you were 5 or 4 and she said that to you? And he's like, no. And I said, okay, so what that is right there, when you can do something that your sister will go along with because she's younger and because she thinks you walk on water, but it's not right, it's not fair. That's what we call an abuse of your power. You're taking the power that you have and you're using it to benefit you, but to hurt somebody else. And I said, that is absolutely never okay in our family, ever, because it doesn't feel good. And we have a responsibility to act in a way that upholds other people, not hurts them. Does
Mhm.
that make sense? Right. And
Mhm.
so that kind of conversation happened lots of times around the place. And I would say,
Mhm.
I have a responsibility to my power. I'm a mom. If ever I do something that feels like it benefits me, but it's totally hurtful to you, we need to talk about it, because I might be misusing my power, right?
Mhm.
When he was 15 or 16, he was going to a youth group at a time at a local progressive church that we had in our community. And I picked him up from youth group one night, and he says to me, "Oh, Mom, boy, I'm glad you weren't there tonight." And I'm like, "Why?" And he goes, "There was this lady, and she came to talk to us about sex." And
Mhm.
I'm like, "Oh, really? So tell me what happened."
Mhm.
Because of course
Mhm.
I'm always interested. And he goes, "She said," and he goes, and I'm not kidding you, she said in front of all of us, "Girls," and she goes like this, "don't you let a boy kiss you too long. It is your job to stop them, because they might not be able to handle it." And I said, "Oh,
We're going to give everyone a pass as they abuse their power, but the girls have to be the ones that stop it.
right."
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
goes, "But Mom, you'd be proud of me." I raised my hand. And then I thought, oh, Lord, because he was 16, he
Yeah.
thought he ruled the world at that point, right?
Yeah.
And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, she called on me." And I said, "So do you mean to tell me and all the boys in here and all the girls in here that girls are responsible for what we do as boys? Because I'm sorry, that is not the way that
Mhm.
I have been raised."
Mhm.
And I'm like, "Oh, man."
Oh,
I
wow.
said, "What did she do?" He said, "She got really, really quiet."
Mm.
And I said, "Honey, that is right. You know that. I will always hold you 100% responsible for everything you choose to say and everything you choose to do, because you're capable of being responsible to
Mhm.
yourself, right?
Mhm.
And to your power and to the influence that you have. And so this ongoing conversation about power was important. He was a white, good looking, blonde haired, blue eyed boy, right? And so I knew the messages he was going to get. I wanted him to be aware of power abuse from the beginning,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Of time. And so sometimes our conversations are a little gendered, a little bit. And but in my family, because he was the oldest, he needed it. I knew he needed it from
Mhm.
a cultural perspective and otherwise. And then also exposing a lot of the patriarchal messages that really just end up hurting people. So we talked a lot about what are the assumed messages out there,
Mhm.
and so, like, when he looked at porn, I said, "We got to talk about this, not because there's anything wrong with your curiosity or whatever." I says, "But I just want you to know that penises all don't look like that,
Mhm.
and vulvas don't all look like that."
Or
uh,
work like that.
right. And because you are somebody that's going to someday want a really good relationship with
Mhm.
somebody that you really love. And I want you to know that just as we don't take advantage of people inside our family, you're not going to want a relationship that takes advantage or exploits somebody or humiliates somebody. And yet there'll be a lot of that in straight porn. And a lot of your friends are going to be all about, tapping that, getting some, all as if she's an object. And you're not going to want anybody you love or any of the women in your life to be thought of that way. I need you to represent that out in the world. And you don't have to do it in a way that gets you ostracized, but please don't go along. Don't go,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't do that. Just get quiet, you know
Mhm.
act
Mhm.
the way that you want to feel good about later in your life. You're writing your own sexual narrative. I need you to feel good about it, because it's a wonderful part of you. But if you start doing it in a way that's hurtful to other people, you're not going to feel good about it. And you're not going to feel good about you.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
important. So, a lot of the conversations that we need to be having in order for women to see where they begin and end and others begin and end, what they have the right to, and the understanding that connection and pleasure, the desire for connection and pleasure is human. We just go about it in different ways, like all of that. It's not a boy thing or a girl thing. It's a human thing, right? All of that has to be explicitly taught and modeled, ideally for kids as they grow, if they're going to have some of these skills later, or else they have to go do some therapy or something to help get clear about it, so that they can develop a voice for themselves. So I think a lot of women don't understand how they're being consensual for something they actually really don't want, because nobody's ever spent the time to help break it down for them. And now they find themselves in a relationship and they're afraid that if I got clean on what's actually happening, I think my partner would leave. Right. And so there's financial implications. There's all kinds of implications, right? She's going to get blamed. Right. I mean, if he has an affair, we still think, oh, well, she must not have been doing something.
Yeah. It becomes a coping mechanism for social safety, of this is how I.
Exactly. So that's why I just think that the conversation about consensual non-consent is such an important conversation to be having. But there's a lot of deconstruction to do around it for people. But yeah, I would say it's completely understandable how we're here. This is what we've been supporting as a culture forever, but especially the last 45 years.
And would you say especially in the evangelical or maybe a greater Christian community?
I would say, no, I wouldn't. I would say, yes, that's been true there, but it's also been true in the places that had were more Bible Belt, less urban, right?
That's kind of the question that's come up from the homogeneous sample that I had. Is this an American problem? Is this a religious problem? Is this what kind of, because the demographics were so similar, that was, white women in the Western United States who were middle class, middle age, and largely Christian, and so, it's part of trying to figure that out is like, is this an American problem? Is this a white problem? Is this a Christian problem? And your answer is your thoughts.
I think it's yes and. Yes. And it's broader than that because there are communities that were I think, more affected by abstinence education and that continuing in their state. And so whether their family itself is religious or not, they were still getting it. It was still around them.
So geography at play based on the politics of that rural community around them.
Yes. Yeah. And I know from supervising people that are in really conservative states who are trying to serve the underserved in those communities, whether it's sexual minorities or others. And it's thick. It's real. Like they feel and they are aware of an amount of risk and threat because there are laws that have been passed.
Right. That limit choices. Right. Yeah, for sure.
That basically tell them who they can serve and who they can't serve. And they could lose their license if they serve a trans family or whatever, I mean, like, and again, this is government. This is not religious, but it is religious.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It totally does. Yeah. That's a super interesting perspective. And I think your book, Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, does a lot for, that third question of what are messages in the evangelical or Christian world that maybe we could use positively or for prevention of this. And, I think that's what I appreciate most about that book of yours is figuring out where the messages are, where the doctrine is, that can spin this and
Yes.
create more positivity,
Yes.
less negativity and shame. And
Right. Like a
Mhm,
lot of people, again, because they've been listening to politicians and pastors who've been listening to politicians,
mhm,
they can't see how far maybe they've swung away from the core values of their faith,
mhm,
right? And so they don't often really know how much they've been influenced um kind of away from, just
helpful interpretations or
yeah, yeah, or even like asking like was was Jesus against the body and sexuality? Was he afraid of it? Did he see it as dangerous? Like, what do we know? And even asking that question, which was, one of the questions I looked at, in the book.
yeah.
But I also said, on the Abrahamic line, has there ever been sex positivity? And there was so much that was there that was never brought forward. But when you do research on the development of the Christian church in those early centuries, you can see that patriarchy, actually, the fall of the Roman Empire, patriarchy
Mm,
was influencing the formation of the Christian church more than the core tenets that are
mhm,
like in the Gospels or whatever. And so a lot of time, again, this is kind of critical thinking. I really want people to hold on to what for them feels most beautiful and affirming of their humanity and how loved they are by God or however they think of it, like you were, you know, perfectly made the way you are. You
mhm.
are meant to be you, right? Some of those core things, but people have to begin to think critically to be like, well, how has the church strayed from that?
Right, right.
And the push to stray has been one that's been about, again, keeping them loyal to the voting bloc
Mm,
to support the capitalist agenda,
mhm.
which is spinning out of control at this point,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. I
So,
don't think I thought of the role of politics in Christianity and the purity movement that got, I don't think I'd put that all together or looked that far back or deep. And so
yeah,
I mean, now I'm like, oh, yeah, I missed that part.
yeah, sure. And it's easy to
Yeah.
miss too. Um,
Mhm,
but I think once you kind of wake up to it, at least my experience has been, this has been true for me, has been now I feel like I see things more clearly. And I'm
mhm,
so much more compassionate. I do
mhm,
understand. I do understand why people are so frightened. And I do understand
mhm,
if you take things hook, line, and sinker, you're going to be scared, you know?
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
Seeing things in context and patriarchy, which has really been about power and control. Who has the
mhm,
power? They'll then have the control. They'll be able to call the shots, whatever. They can now say whatever they want to. That's been the guiding principle shaping our institutions and our government, and not just ours, but others around the world, right?
mhm, mhm.
And it's also, if we imagine changing that, it creates a lot of fear for a lot of people. Like, could we have a more egalitarian society?
Yeah, yeah.
Could we? I was listening one time to, oh gosh, I'm blanking on her name. To an interview with Ruby Sales, and she's a Black spiritual activist who's probably 80 now,
Mm,
and grew up in the Black gospel church,
mhm,
and she was describing it, and and she said the children were as important as the adults. They ran
mm,
around all Sunday morning. If they had an idea, they came up and they said it. They led us in song. And it was this beautiful picture of what an egalitarian community religious setting could look like, with
Mhm.
everybody in it together and every
Without the authoritarianism, without that patriarchy. Yeah,
not
yeah.
patriarchal. It was everybody has value. You're fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. You go say your thing. You know what I mean? Like, and they might be there all day long. But
Mm-hmm.
it just was this beautiful picture of, oh, that's what it looks like when there isn't hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you believe in a faith where there isn't a hierarchy necessarily like that, where you are valuable and every other human is equally as valuable, but not more and not less
Mm-hmm.
valuable, then you might shape the gathering and the creation of organizations differently.
Differently.
We have a lot of people that are afraid of that, and it serves in the heterosexual world, it serves men that women are subservient and don't have voice and don't have choice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so then they take that into the bedroom. And this is what makes me so sad, I think, is that there's so many men in these types of relationships who aren't getting their wife when they're sexual.
Mm.
She's not behind her eyes. She doesn't want to be there, but she doesn't have voice, and he can feel it. And it
Yeah.
doesn't feel good to him. Men so
Right.
often say, I don't like it. I just
Right.
don't know what else to do,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I'm like, can you trust me enough to help you help her and help her to actually be listened to find out what pleasure and connection really looks like to her, and then for you to learn her and affirm her and support her and be patient and see sexuality, good sex,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as any time you both show up to each other and you want it to be connecting and fun and pleasurable for both of you. And
Mm-hmm.
it could look different than it ever looked before today.
Right. Right.
And you're
And I
willing
think,
to go for
yeah,
it.
you're answering those last two questions. I totally want to be mindful of your time, but those last two questions of, if this couple lands on your couch, are you
Yeah.
diagnosing her with a desire disorder, or are you looking at this completely differently? And what are you going to do with them?
Mhm.
You know, I
I would say, obviously, you have desire discrepancies.
hmm hmm
But then I go into a thing where I say there's a difference in my book between sex drive, that's your desire to move through your arousal cycle. Men and women, all people, often, not all people, but most people have this feeling like I want to move through my arousal cycle. It has to do with hormones more than anything. And it really has had to do with keeping our species alive,
hmm
right? And in my book, you have two hands to deal with that. It is never your partner's responsibility
mm
to take you through your arousal cycle if they don't want to participate in that way.
That's how
However,
you start to get the hierarchy evened out.
right. Well, what I want them to see that drive is different than desire. And when I talk
Okay.
about sexual desire, what I'm talking about is, and I'll say this directly, you want intimacy with her. You want her to be there. You want her to want you, to want
Mhm.
to be there. You want to feel that heat and fire and desire in her, right? And he's like,
Mhm.
yes, I haven't felt it in forever. And it's like, and you want to feel like you can even have it safely and
Mhm.
no one's going to hurt you or take advantage or exploit you or make you do something you don't want to do. She's like, yeah, that's why I don't want to do it ever. Okay. So let's go to that place where you want to be seen, known, loved, and accepted by your partner, and you want to be seen, known, loved, and accepted by your partner. That's intimacy. We have a human desire for intimacy, and our hands are never going to get us there.
Mm.
As
Mhm.
together as a couple, we can get there, but it takes a lot of different kinds of skills, and we did not give them to you as a culture. It is our fault. We set you up for this transactional sexual life, but here's the good news, we can teach you to have this with each other.
Mhm.
And when you do, your sex life is going to become like a banquet. So rather than having Cheerios for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you're going to be like, no, you know what I feel like? I feel like Thai food. what kind of Thai food sounds good to you? You know, you're going to have a
Mhm.
very different kind of sexual life because it's all going to, good sex is going to be about connection and pleasure and fun.
Mhm.
It's not going to be about this or that behavior. You guys are going to decide together, and it's going to change when one of you is sick and as you
Mm,
get older. And because it's meant to, sexuality, according to the Torah, you know, ancient literature, is meant to bond you through your life cycle, through your whole life. It's touch that makes you feel connected to the person that you're bonded to, you know, and that's what it's
mhm.
about. And that's what it's actually always really kind of been about, you know, as far as in the context of committed relationships.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
It's been about learning how to cultivate that with each other. And you
Mhm.
can do that. And it's really fun to do with couples. It's super fun to do. But in that process of doing that, they end up confronting a lot of the assumptions
Right.
that they were given growing up. And they have all a lot of feelings about, they feel anger, they feel betrayed, they feel like, you know, and they start to separate out patriarchy and church doctrine that was made to benefit men in power from what feels right in their heart. You know, what
Mhm.
feels
Mhm.
loving, what feels just, you know,
Mhm.
feels
Yeah.
caring, you know, all of that. And they start to figure that out. And people are, I believe people are just as spiritually oriented now as always in my life that
Mhm.
I've known,
Mhm.
but they are, a lot of people are separating out patriarchy and what's benefited certain people from their core tenets of their faith or what they believe is right and human and nourishing and and helps them deal with existential questions, right?
Mhm. 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 Mm. This was fantastic. I appreciate it so much.
I've really taken you everywhere, and I hope that you'll be able to
I
distill some
love
of
it.
that.
I will. I've got transcript turned on, so I'll find your words. I'm just absorbing it and listening. And do you have any like closing thoughts, like op-ed kind of commentary thoughts about this like, new idea? Maybe it's not a new idea, it's maybe a new term for an old idea of, hey, there might be some bad things to happen if we consent to unwanted sex over a long period of time.
I think that even that conversation, consenting to unwanted sex, um, and looking at the impact of that, even that is an intervention.
Okay. Even naming this new idea as a
Naming the new
possibility.
idea is an
Mhm.
intervention.
Mm.
Well, I thought my mom, you know, like this, I've heard these things, you know, my mom told me that this is what it was, that I was just going to need to say yes.
Right.
Like the idea that I have the right to something different is, I've never even thought of that before. Yeah.
Mhm.
But tell me about, are there places within you, even if they're quiet places, that are just resentful that you were told you had to do that and that you have been any place? And usually they're like, yes,
Yeah.
it's there. Like, do you think, I'm going to throw out something crazy, like if we imagine that every human has value, and so you are just as valuable as any other human, including men, and that we are meant to know love, like to be seen, known, loved, and accepted by our, in our partnerships, by our dearest friends, by our family members, right?
Mhm.
If we just took that as an assumption, do you think that you were meant to experience something that includes your whole body, your heart, your mind, your spirituality, your sexuality? You're all there
Mhm.
in the sexual act. Do you think you were meant to experience it in a way that doesn't feel respectful to you,
Mhm.
kind to you,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
cares about the fact that you don't feel like it? Like,
Mhm.
and you know, so they begin to ask questions like, do you want this for your daughters? Do you want this
Right.
for your sons? You know, and they can often go there,
I
right?
know, really quick. They're like, not for
Really
my
quick,
daughter. Yeah.
really quick. Both men and women can go there really quick. And, you know, so you kind of are using that. It's like, so what I'm working with here is that I believe when something's a truth, it works for all people in all time. So if it's not okay with your kids, it's not okay for you. It's not okay for your husband. What would be true for all people? What would be true for your best friend, for your kiddos, right? Let's talk about that, right? And then let's ask ourselves, who's been benefiting from the idea that men get and women have to put up with? What systems have been benefiting from that? Let's talk about that. Because it's been surviving because somebody's been wanting it. Who's been wanting it, And so we get into kind of pulling things apart a little bit so that they can be really clear with what is right for them, what is true in their heart for themselves and for their kids and for their culture and their neighborhood and whatever, like they can start to be like, oh, this is what feels most respectful to me or kind to me or loving to me or whatever. Okay, let's work with that because you deserve that. I believe when you came into the world, just like when your kiddos came into the world or your nieces and nephews, you were and are just as precious and deserve to be seen, known, loved, and accepted.
And somewhere through politics and religion, that message sounds super Christian and maybe not very loud today, right? That you deserve to be seen, loved, known, and accepted for who you are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gotten really lost. And I think obviously you've probably picked this up. I think it's because it got polluted by money, power, more polluted. If you go back in history, you can see it in the Roman Empire, which shaped the development of the early church. It's been there all along, patriarchy, but it pollutes or attempts to pollute love and justice. And I think it's in the context of love and justice that we thrive, as people. And it's what I want for my children and my grandchildren and, and my neighbors. And we live better together when there's love and justice. When I pay attention to my effect on you and you pay attention to your effect on me, that we have an ecology of a relationship.
Right.
As opposed to I'm an individual, it's my rights trump your rights. That is unsustainable. That creates wars. That does not create bonded relationships. That creates every couple that walks into our office is having a right, wrong, right argument. We don't teach people the ecology of relationship, the ecology of my relationship to the earth, to my neighbors, to my family, to my kids. We teach capitalism and production, and that's what makes you valuable.
Yeah, and that produces commodity and transaction, which is not fun sexually. No. Sex is a commodity and sex is transaction.
No. And I have often wondered, is that why we're seeing kind of a drop in sort of sexual satisfaction, sexual lives of a lot of our Gen Xers and Gen Ys, because they're tired of the BS. They're not going to put up with things, but they don't know how to make it better. So they just are saying, no, I don't want that.
Yeah.
But when they go looking for answers, there's such a dearth. It's there. You can find it in books and stuff. It's there. And certainly we have more and more podcasts now, which is nice, but it's my fantasy is that we start trying to change the legacy with children so that kids grow up seeing this in themselves and seeing it in each other and cultivating it in their communities, because it's going to change everything. If we just provide comprehensive sex education, relationship education, sex education, and emotional intelligence, these kinds of things, if we just like the Northern European countries do, we would change our culture. We would change our politics.
Maybe in a generation. We started now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which, is how that second book, How Shameless, came along, and I have handouts for doctors and teachers and therapists and clergy to hand to people. You got a 2-year-old here, you got an 8-year-old here, I would just, because I know that that's the fastest way to get it changed. People have good relationships, So there's you've probably heard of it, but the Harvard, um, I think it's an 85-year study that they've been doing on happiness.
Yes, the happiness lab thing.
Mhm.
Hmm.
It's all about relationships, and yet that's
Yeah,
what we least invest in as a culture.
yeah. My 14-year-old came home yesterday and said, "Did you know the people who live the longest, most satisfied lives?" And she was so excited about it to learn that.
Yes.
And she's very relational anyway. But I was like, "Oh, I'm so glad they're teaching you this." I'm never quite sure what's getting cut and what's getting funded. And
Right.
I'm like,
But
"Oh, I'm glad
yay.
y'all got that message." Yeah.
Yeah. Yay
Hmm.
for that teacher for bringing that
Hmm.
up. And then saying, well, so how do we do that? Like how do we live relationally successfully? What are the skills I have to have? You have to have, you know? Yeah, let's do that. Because yeah, I think we could flip things. I'm always like, okay, let's do that. And then let's let's get really serious about the fact that we want to end unwanted pregnancies. Because we could
Hmm.
end it today if we wanted it.
Hmm.
Okay? We could end it today if every person with a penis that plans to stick that in a vagina promises from this moment forward, they will either have it covered or they will get a vasectomy. Now we have no more unwanted pregnancies.
And that shift we have to be able to, in our mind, to realign the authority of whose job is what. And for
That's
many
right.
people, that idea of there
Yes.
being male responsibility in an
Yes.
unwanted pregnancy is just like never even there,
No, it's not. And
all
it's because as a culture, again, patriarchy, that's what we support, right? There's a great book called Ejaculate Responsibly, and it grew out of a mom blog, and it's 28 reasons why that makes sense. Because they always know when they're fertile. Their contraceptions, they can get on the counter at any grocery store. They don't have to see a doctor. It doesn't cost anything. There are 28 reasons why, if we really wanted to stop it, we could stop it today. That
Mm,
doesn't mean we necessarily are stopping, like needing to end a pregnancy that is going to cost
right.
somebody their life, or it's a topic or whatever. We're going to still have to deal with that. That's fine. But that's such a small percentage, right? And if we really as a country cared about this, we wouldn't be putting it on women. We'd be putting it on men. But we don't.
No.
That's another one of the BS things that is out there is being taught, that we're making this, and instead really what we're doing is we're continuing to say we want to be able to control women's bodies and choices and lives, period.
Mhm.
And
And
we're not
this,
even where we were in 74.
right, right. It's so frustrating to feel as though we had moved and then go, oh, we haven't moved at all, and
We've gone
And
back.
and I hadn't really yet, I appreciate you opening my mind. I hadn't really thought of consenting to unwanted sex in any political or economic or, I don't think I thought past purity culture and to the
Yeah.
systems that
Mm-hmm.
perpetuated and promoted the
Mm-hmm.
purity culture that so many of us found unhelpful.
Right. Well, and yeah, and
Mhm.
we were. Yeah, I would recommend looking at Frank Schaeffer's book, because
Mhm.
it's going to give you a lot of info just on that sort of what was happening culturally that has continued to shape things, because purity culture was at the mercy of, or was a creation of politics. That's what they used, was the religious right, and
Mhm.
they developed the religious right and moral majority and used the religious people, and just basically said, if you really love God, if you really love your faith, you will vote this way and you will believe these things. And it's just continued that way.
Mhm.
It's a good documentary too. The people that did Misrepresentation and the Mask You Live In, the Representation Project, they did one called The Great American Lie, and that explains when the different laws were passed that rolled back the taxes that then took us from a place of like a 40% difference between our highest paid
Mm,
corporate person and to like thousands and thousands percent
yeah.
difference that we are now. And that's again really shaping culture,
Mhm.
and the religious people who don't think have continued to be a pawn for that agenda.
Mm. Thank you for your time and
You
your
bet. Good luck
thoughts.
with everything. I'm
Thank you.
so excited about what you're doing. Do, drop me a note every now and again. And if you've
Okay.
got anything to send, anything you're writing up, I'd just love to read it and follow it.
Okay. Thank you so much. I
You
appreciate your
bet.
enthusiasm too. That's a gift. So
Absolutely.
thank
All
you.
right. Yeah.
Okay. Have
Take
a good
care.
one.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.